Have you ever received a call in the middle of the night and sensed something was wrong before you even answered? Well, what if I told you that, in this case, every ring of the phone isn't just an annoying sound, but an inevitable announcement of death? Before we begin, let me ask you a question. Are you subscribed to the channel? If not, take advantage now, because what I'm about to tell you today isn't the kind of story you'll find elsewhere. And, if you can, leave a like and comment on what you thought. This helps the content reach more people and keep this investigation alive. What I'm about to reveal here is as paradoxical as it is disturbing. On the one hand, we have a logical pattern. Always at midnight, the phone rings. On the other, we have the impossible. There's no record of the call, and yet, hours later, the foretold death occurs. It's a clash of technology and mystery, science and paranormality that challenges even the most skeptical. And the most intriguing thing is that this story doesn't begin today. It spans decades, has survived the replacement of wooden doors with fiber optic cables, and yet continues to manifest itself with the same deadly precision. We're talking about something that adapts to the times, as if it had its own intelligence. And believe me, once you start noticing the pattern, you won't sleep peacefully anymore. So, get ready, because I'm not just going to tell you the facts. I'm going to take you behind the scenes of this investigation, show you the records no one wanted you to see, and maybe make you think twice before answering that unexpected midnight call. When you're in the deepest silence of the night, have you ever noticed how every sound seems to take on a life of its own? I learned this firsthand after years of investigating cases that would make anyone swear it was just coincidence, until it wasn't. My involvement with the phone that rings at midnight began just like that, an insistent, cold and calculated ringing, interrupting the sleep of people who had no idea it would be the last time they heard their own breathing. It wasn't just a phone ringing. It was a harbinger, always at the same time, midnight sharp. A voice, unhurried and emotionless, announced a name. The most disturbing part, hours later, the person announced was found dead, with no clear signs of violence, no witnesses, no plausible explanation. It was as if the call were the sentence, and the death sentence merely the execution of the verdict. I dealt with complex crimes before, meticulously planned murders, disappearances that seemed to be the work of chance. But this case struck me in a different way. There was something about it that didn't fit the laws of logic. The voice was always the same, but it didn't seem human enough to be just a criminal behind a telephone. It was as if it came from a place where time and space didn't follow the same rules as us. And that's when I realized that, more than a crime, I was facing a phenomenon, a repetitive pattern, impossible to ignore, and worse, impossible to stop. That first night I heard about this case ignited an almost morbid curiosity in me. Because if there's a call capable of announcing a death before it happens, who's to say I couldn't be the next to answer? The first record of this case isn't in a modern report, but in a dusty file hidden in the basement of a police station that no longer exists. It was in 1984, in a small coastal town called Vila do Faro. I remember leafing through those yellowed pages and smelling the scent of old paper mixed with the sea air, as if the town itself had absorbed the memory of what happened. There, the phone rang for the first time at midnight, and a life was lost just hours later. The victim was a local fisherman, known by all, one of those men who could read the sea like an open book. The night before his death, his wife said she saw him wake up in a cold sweat, talking about a long, cold tap that made him shiver. When the police registered the incident, there were no signs of foul play, just a lifeless body at the edge of the bed and a phone with no call log, as if the call had never happened. Upon investigation, I realized that, at the time, technology wasn't capable of accurately tracking calls. Curiously, even so, telephone technicians claimed the phone couldn't have rung. There was no active line at that address, a detail that, to this day, no one has been able to explain. It was as if the phone had been merely a conduit for something that came from far beyond the city's cables and poles. And this is where the story begins to take on a twist that defies common sense. Because if this call didn't come from a number, where did it come from? This question lingered in my mind for months, until other cases began to emerge, all with the same signature. And then, my friend, I knew I was facing something that went far beyond Vila do Faro. Over time, I realized that the victims in this case weren't chosen at random. I spent weeks cross-referencing data, sifting through police records, court records, and even newspaper clippings that were nearly falling apart. Apparently, there was no direct connection between them. Different ages, distinct professions, life stories, with no obvious overlap. But there was something more subtle, almost invisible, connecting them all. Something that wasn't written on the papers, but revealed itself between the lines. Some were young people, full of plans. Others lonely elderly. Some even well-known figures in the community. But all of them, without exception, had experienced a traumatic event in the recent past. A loss, an accident, a mistake they couldn't make amends for. It was as if each carried an open wound in their soul, and that wound somehow called forth that connection. It's disturbing to think that it wasn't what they did in the present that mattered, but rather what they carried within themselves. I spoke with family and friends and noticed that days before their deaths, many of them exhibited subtle changes in behavior. Some became quieter, others became overly agitated. Some even commented that they felt like someone was watching. It's easy to dismiss this as paranoia or coincidence until you see the pattern repeat itself more than a dozen times, always with the same outcome. This discovery changed the way I looked at the case. I began to understand that perhaps we weren't just dealing with a killer, but with something or someone who knew where to poke to hit each victim at their most vulnerable point. And believe me, when you realize this, you begin to wonder if this connection isn't just a warning, but also a choice. It was while reviewing the testimonies that I noticed a detail that sent chills down my spine. Almost all of the victims, days before their deaths, had told someone that they dreamed of a telephone ringing. And it wasn't just any ringing. It was a sound described as metallic, dragging, almost painful to hear. Most said they woke up sweating, with the feeling that the dream had left something stuck in them, as if the ringing still echoed in the back of their minds. A widow, who could barely speak without crying, told me that her husband woke up in the middle of the night, pale, claiming that the phone is calling me. Detail: they didn't even have a landline at home. Another case involved a young woman who wrote in her diary, "If I answer, I won't come back." These records carry enormous psychological weight because they show that the call didn't begin in the physical world. It first invaded the subconscious. And that, to me, is the scariest part. It means the victim was already marked before even hearing the actual ring. It was as if the dream was the preparation, the bait, and the next day, when the phone actually rang, the victim was already vulnerable enough to, well, you know the outcome. This completely changed the approach to the investigation. We weren't just tracing calls, we were hunting for something that crossed the line between dream and reality. This point opened a new line of reasoning in my mind. What if the phone wasn't just an object, but a conduit? What if whatever was behind the calls didn't have to follow the same rules we living beings follow? These questions began to pile up in my head, and the next clue would only make everything even more confusing. When the police began investigating, the first step was obvious. Trace the call. It seemed simple. Every phone call leaves a trail. Right? Wrong. Initial attempts at identification returned completely clean lines, as if the call had never occurred. Technicians reviewed reports, cross-referenced carrier records, and even sought support from outside experts. Nothing. Zero. It was like trying to find footprints in the wind. I had access to these initial reports, and I confess I was struck by the investigators' frustration. They even suspected a system error, or that someone inside was deleting the records. But the inconsistency went beyond technology. There were cases where the phone rang in homes without an active line, or even in places where the device was unplugged. This completely undermined any technical logic. A veteran police officer told me that, with the third victim, they attempted a wiretap. They set up equipment to record and monitor everything in real time, and guess what? At midnight the phone rang, but none of the devices recorded any sound. To those in the room, the call was clear and audible, but on the recording devices there was only silence, as if the sound existed only for those who were supposed to hear it. This inability to technically prove what everyone knew was happening eroded the team's confidence. And when an investigation begins to be discredited, it becomes much easier for fear to creep in. And it was precisely in this climate of distrust and tension that the next chapter of this story began to unfold. When the telecommunications experts were finally called in, The expectation was that they would provide clear, cold, and objective answers. After all, technology always finds an explanation, right? But what they found only made things more ominous. First, they confirmed what was already suspected. The number didn't exist. It wasn't in any national or international database. It was like a digital ghost, appearing out of nowhere and disappearing the next instant. The most disturbing aspect was the voice analysis. Using spectrum and frequency software, they noticed that there were none of the natural variations that every human being exhibits when speaking. No micro-hesitations, discrete breaths, or subtle changes in tone. The voice was linear, too perfect to be human, but it also didn't seem synthesized by any technology known at the time. Some experts even said the timbre contained impossible components, frequencies that shouldn't exist in the normal hearing range. This discovery created a stalemate. If it wasn't human and it wasn't machine, then what was it? It was at this point that the case began to slip from the police's grasp and fall into my lap. Because when science stumbles, someone must be willing to look into the darkest corners where logic can't penetrate. And I, after years of seeing the improbable happen, knew I was about to cross another invisible frontier. The expert's final report concluded with a dry sentence, but one that still gives me chills. The origin and nature of the audio are unknown. We recommend against proceeding with tests that could expose operators to adverse psychological effects. This, to me, was less a technical warning and more a dangerous invitation. And I accepted without a second thought. As suspicions began to mount that someone inside the telephone company might be behind these calls, one name kept cropping up: Alvaro Mendez, a veteran telephone operator. He knew the network like no other, had access to restricted areas, and was known for fixing problems that even younger engineers couldn't solve. He seemed like the kind of man who, if he wanted to, could make a phone ring in the middle of the desert. We decided to question him. But on the scheduled day, Alvaro simply didn't show up for work. Colleagues said he'd left early the night before, claiming a headache. No one had seen him since. The apartment was intact, with no signs of forced entry, and his motorcycle was still parked in the garage. The only strange detail: the house's landline phone had been ripped from the wall. Searching his closet at the telephone exchange, I found a folder full of technical notes, diagrams, and codes that even the most experienced engineers couldn't decipher. Among the sheets was a post-it note with a handwritten sentence: "If it rings for you, don't answer." This gave me the uneasy feeling that he knew a lot more than he was letting on, and perhaps that was why he had been silenced. Alvaro's disappearance was the first time I felt like we weren't just chasing a culprit, but racing against something moving faster than us. And while the police focused on finding him, the phone rang again, announcing another death. As the number of victims mounted, I realized that the case was not only claiming lives, but also mentally destroying those left behind. Psychiatrists who followed the families began to notice a disturbing pattern. They all displayed similar symptoms of paranoia in the days before their loved one's death. Constant fear, insomnia, and a strange feeling of being watched were almost universal. I myself interviewed a mother who lost her daughter. She told me that for the past week, she couldn't be alone in any room in the house because she felt a cold feeling in her back, as if someone was always behind her. Another father reported that the sound of any phone, even a neighbor's cell phone, sent him into panic. It's as if the call didn't just affect the intended victim, but cast a shadow over everyone around them. Psychiatrists have hypothesized that it could be a phenomenon of psychological contagion, a fear so intense that it spreads like a virus among those who live with the victim. But personally, I think there was something more. It was as if the phone ringing left an invisible mark, an echo that infiltrated the minds of those nearby, slowly and inevitably eroding sanity. This emotional contamination made everything more dangerous. We weren't just dealing with mysterious deaths, but with a kind of collective collapse. And when an entire community begins to lose itself in fear, it becomes much easier for the next touch to find its way. It was during a conversation with a local historian that I first heard a theory linking the case to something much older. He told me about a devastating fire that occurred in 1953 at an isolated orphanage high on a hill. The tragedy took the lives of 23 children and a nun who, according to records, desperately tried to call for help using the institution's only telephone. The detail that left me cold was that the fire started shortly after midnight. The historian said that, according to witnesses at the time, nearby neighbors swore they heard the phone ringing incessantly, even while the building was in flames. No emergency calls were recorded, but some residents claimed they answered and heard only faint breathing, followed by a piercing silence. Over time, the story became an urban legend, something older people told to scare children. But the records I found showed that the orphanage's phone was connected to an experimental line from the time, one that was never officially deactivated. This made me wonder if the origin of these calls might somehow be stuck in that spot in the past, like an open wound that refuses to heal. The orphanage connection didn't prove anything, but it did cast an even more sinister shadow over the case. And if this story were true, it meant the midnight phone call wasn't just a warning, but perhaps a cry for help that had been echoing for decades, waiting for someone to finally answer it. When I began digging through the city's oldest archives, I found accounts that predated the very use of telephones there. They were police records and local newspaper entries from the late 19th century. In them, residents described a disturbing pattern: always at midnight, 3 sharp knocks on the door, followed by absolute silence. The next day, someone near that house would be found dead. This sequence happened so often that the older generation began to call it the midnight visit. The curious thing is that no one ever saw who or what was making these knocks. In some cases, families opened their doors immediately and found nothing: no footprints in the snow, no marks on the dirt floor. In others, the sound was so loud, it sounded like the door was about to be broken down, but when they investigated, the room was intact. It was as if the knocking had no physical origin, but something that only manifested itself to those destined to hear it. Records indicate that this phenomenon gradually disappeared with the arrival of the telephone in the city. It's as if the message had found a new channel to express itself, exchanging the wood of doors for the cold metal and plastic of the devices. This transition was not officially documented, but it's impossible to ignore that the temporal pattern, exact midnight, remained intact, as did the ultimate consequence, death. Reading these accounts sent a chill down my spine. It was as if I were witnessing a continuous line of events, adapting to technological changes over time. And if that were indeed the case, it would mean the case I was investigating wasn't something new, but an entity or force that had always been there, simply changing its presentation. And this realization led me straight to the next strand in this web. That's when I realized that death wasn't the only possible outcome of these calls. In at least 4 documented cases, the announced victim simply disappeared. No body, no clues, no record of movement. The first was a mailman named Raoul, known throughout the neighborhood. He received the call at midnight, was seen leaving his house at 3 in the morning, and never returned. His bicycle was found intact, leaning against the post office door, as if it had been left there in a hurry. The second disappearance was even more enigmatic. A 19-year-old student named Beatrice lived with 2 roommates. They reported that, after answering the phone, Beatrice stood there, staring into space for almost a minute. Then she grabbed a coat and said she needed to see something. She was last seen entering a dimly lit alley, captured on a security camera that revealed a chilling detail. In the footage, she wasn't alone. Beside her, an elongated shadow walked at the same pace, but there was no one physically present. The other 2 cases occurred in different regions of the country, but followed the same pattern. The call would come in, the victim would act strangely, and then soon disappear as if wiped off the map. Experienced police officers told me it looked more like a kidnapping without a trace, but no kidnapping is so perfect that it doesn't leave even a footprint, a hair, or a sound captured on camera. These disappearances added an even darker layer to the case. Because if until then I'd believed the call was merely a harbinger of death, now I had to consider the possibility that some people answered and were taken somewhere, a place from which no one returned. And, to my surprise, the next clue seemed to point precisely to where that place might be. I met retired Sergeant Oliveira on a rainy afternoon in a discreet downtown coffee shop. He called me over, saying he had something the police didn't want to keep. Inside a worn briefcase were a small reel-to-reel tape recorder and 3 tapes, all labeled with dates that coincided with cases investigated years ago. Oliveira explained that during his career, he tried to record the calls for study, but that, by order of superiors, these tapes were never to see the light of day. It was as if someone had decided that certain truths needed to remain buried. We took the recorder to a quiet room, and as the first tape began to roll, I heard the metallic ringing so many witnesses had described. Immediately afterward, the voice cold, even, almost mechanical, pronouncing a name, but there was something else. In the background, very subtle, a muffled sound, like a distant murmur. We backed away and turned up the volume, and that's when I realized it wasn't just any murmur, but several voices, overlapping, speaking simultaneously in languages I didn't recognize. Most disturbingly, these voices didn't appear at the exact moment the phone rang, but in the silences between sentences, as if they were filling the empty spaces with coded messages or laments. Oliveira, visibly shaken, said he could never listen to these recordings alone at night. He believed that each time he played them, something grew closer to him. Before I said goodbye, the sergeant handed me the folder and said, with a heavy look in his eyes, "If you're going to listen to it again, don't do it alone." But as an investigator, I couldn't resist. And that night, when I listened to the second tape, I realized something that would completely change my understanding of the case. We decided it was time to put the phenomenon to the test. We chose a house where a man lived, who, according to patterns we had already identified, would be the next to receive the call. We installed high-resolution cameras in every room, directional microphones, and redundant audio recorders, all connected to an external central station to prevent any loss of footage. The idea was simple: if the phone rang at midnight, we would have every detail recorded, with no room for interpretation. In the early hours of the night, everything went as normal. The nervous resident tried to maintain his routine, while two other investigators and I monitored every movement through the makeshift central station in the neighboring house. A few minutes before midnight, something strange began to happen. A static noise filled the headphones and the camera images began to distort. It was as if reality itself was being pulled out of sync. When the clock struck exactly 00, the phone rang. The sound cut through the air like a blade, but at the switchboard, all we heard was silence. The cameras, all of them, froze in the same split second, freezing images that showed the man standing still, staring at the phone. For more than 20 seconds, none of the technology worked, and as soon as the phone stopped ringing, everything returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. Upon reviewing the files, we realized there was no record of that exact minute. It was as if time had been cropped and removed from the recordings. Most disconcerting was seeing that, in the final image before freezing, the man's reflection in the window didn't correspond to his actual movement. This made it clear we were dealing with something that didn't obey the laws of physics. We know, and that the next step could be even more dangerous. Up until that point, we had assumed that the calls and deaths were always linked by physical proximity. It was logical to think so. After all, common crimes follow a certain radius of action. But this logic fell apart when, after cross-referencing old data, I realized that some announced victims weren't even in the city at the time they received the call. The most striking case was that of a businessman who on the day of the call was over 1,000 kilometers away staying in a luxury hotel. I spoke with the receptionist at this hotel, who told me that at midnight, the room phone rang. She knew the exact time because she was finishing her shift and recording everything in the system. The guest answered, remained silent for a few seconds, and without saying a word, hung up. The next day he was found dead in the elevator, with no signs of violence, staring intently and looking utterly astonished. The cameras showed he entered alone, but the elevator door opened to reveal his lifeless body. Another case involved a teacher traveling on a cruise ship. In the middle of the ocean, with no contact with shore, the cabin's internal telephone rang at midnight. The ship recorded the event, but was unable to trace the origin of the call. She was found hours later, collapsed on the deck, with no plausible medical explanation. The ship's doctor swore he had never seen a body collapse without any prior warning. These occurrences expanded the scale of the phenomenon to something that went far beyond geographical barriers. The connection didn't need to be physically close to the victim. It was as if the origin could cross any distance, any obstacle, and worse, any logical barrier we tried to impose. And this realization would make the next event much more personal for me. I never thought that, after so many years investigating cases like this, I would end up at the center of my own story. But that night, fate decided to reverse the tables. I was alone in my apartment, reviewing notes, when the landline, which I almost never use, started ringing. I glanced at the clock. Exactly midnight. For a moment, I froze. It was as if every story I had ever heard materialized before me, compressed into that prolonged metallic sound. I took a deep breath, remembering every victim who described the chills that ran down their spine before answering. But I knew that, as an investigator, ignoring that call would betray everything I was trying to uncover. I slowly picked up the receiver, and on the other end, absolute silence. Then, a voice, firm, emotionless, pronounced my full name. The detail that chilled me the most? The intonation was identical to that of every recording I'd ever studied. I felt a weight in the air, as if the space had become denser. My reflection in the window seemed to be watching me with a delay, and my breathing grew heavy. The voice said, nothing more, simply maintaining that vivid silence, as if expecting something from me. And then, without a goodbye or the sound of hanging up, the call ended. I stood there, receiver in hand, listening to the non-existent echo of that moment. From that moment on, I stopped being just an observer. I became part of the pattern. I didn't know if this meant my fate was sealed, or if I had just been given the chance to understand the truth from within. But deep down, I knew something much worse was coming, and that the next step was inevitable. After the call reached me, I realized I wasn't the only one carrying this shadow. Police officers working on the case began reporting dreams eerily similar to those of the victims. In their descriptions, they were alone in a long hallway, hearing a phone ring in the distance. The closer they tried to get, the more the sound seemed to come from all directions at once. Some woke up sweating, certain the phone was about to ring for real. An investigator named Silvera told me, his face pale, that he heard the ringing while driving in traffic. He looked at his cell phone, but it was silent. The sound, he said, came from inside his own head, pulsing like an internal alarm. Another agent said the ringing even occurred during interrogations, distracting him to the point of losing the thread of the conversation. It was as if the phenomenon was infiltrating the team's subconscious. These incidents began to compromise the investigation. Agents requested leave, citing anxiety attacks, insomnia, and paranoia. One of them even destroyed his home phone, believing it would protect himself. But according to his wife, the ringing continued, echoing through the room, even though there was no device. This made me realize we were dealing with something beyond physical objects. This mental contamination spread like a silent disease, corroding the sanity of those who dared to get too close to the truth. And when I realized I myself was dreaming of corridors and distant touches, I understood that the next step might be crossing a point of no return. Amid the psychological chaos and increasingly disturbing reports, an attempt emerged to bring the investigation back to the realm of logic. Some experts suggested that it could all be the work of an extremely skilled hacker. The theory was that he was using advanced spoofing techniques to mask the origin of the calls, creating the illusion of a non-existent number. At first glance, it seemed like a plausible explanation. After all, modern technology is capable of impressive and frightening things. However, this hypothesis began to crumble as soon as we analyzed older cases. How could we explain calls recorded in 1962 or even 1948 when the internet didn't even exist? Not to mention that, in some of these incidents, the phone rang on inactive lines or even physically disconnected from the network. No digital intrusion technique could explain this, especially when we're talking about purely analog devices or isolated local systems. Another disturbing detail was the uniformity of the voice. Hackers, no matter how advanced, still rely on recordings or synthesizers, but the timbre recorded in these calls presented patterns impossible to replicate with known technology, and this included a resonant frequency that didn't fit into the traditional human or electronic spectrum. It was as if we were dealing with something that used human infrastructure only as a medium, but wasn't originally from it. With each attempt to rationalize, more inconsistencies emerged, and as logical hypotheses fell apart, all that was left was to face what had been growing like an inevitable shadow, the possibility that the origin of the connections was not merely technological, nor of this world. It was on a freezing dawn that I met Donna Clarice, a respected medium in the region, known for helping with disappearance investigations. She welcomed me into her simple home, with walls covered in crucifixes and candles lit in every corner. Before I could even explain the case, she looked at me intently and said, "The voice you heard is that of a woman, one who died trying to prevent something terrible, but no one listened to her." That made my stomach churn, because it sounded more like a diagnosis than a supposition. Donna Clarice stated that, during an embodiment session, she felt the presence of this woman begging for someone to open the door before it was too late. According to her, the woman had been murdered while trying to report a crime that involved more people than it should have, and her death had left an echo trapped between worlds. This echo would find, in the telephone, a perfect channel to manifest itself and try to prevent tragedies, but for some reason, the call didn't save anyone. It only announced death. I asked how this could explain the coldness of the voice and the absence of emotions. Clarice said that when the soul is trapped for decades, it loses the ability to convey feelings as it once did. What remains is a repetition, a raw, almost mechanical message, kept alive only by the original trauma. According to her, it was no ordinary spirit, but something that had already surpassed the limits of what we call human. I left her house with more questions than answers. If that hypothesis were real, we would be facing a phenomenon that didn't seek to kill, but that, somehow, became an inevitable part of the death process. And the next clue would lead me straight to where it all might have begun. Months passed, crossing data, addresses, dates, and even geographic coordinates. At first, there seemed no connection between the victims, but when all the points were superimposed on a map, something began to emerge, a sort of irregular pattern, almost like an imperfect circle. The center of this pattern was in an isolated area outside the city, where the brush had already swallowed up roads and old buildings, and right in the middle was an abandoned building with no recent official record. I decided to go alone. The dirt road was shrouded in fog, and the silence was so absolute that even my own breathing seemed too loud. When I arrived, I saw that the building was an old telephone exchange, decommissioned decades ago. The windows were broken, and loose wires hung like exposed veins. It was as if time had stopped there, but the air carried a strange, almost electric energy. Upon entering, I found dust-covered tables, old appliances still plugged in, and a massive switchboard filled with tangled cables. In the center of the room, a single black telephone stood intact, as if it had been placed there yesterday. It was the same model described in the oldest cases I'd investigated. Without touching anything, I noticed the receiver was slightly off the hook, and yet a faint, steady sound escaped it, like distant breathing. I stood there, feeling the weight of the moment. I knew if I answered, I might get answers, or never leave. But before I could decide, the phone rang, and the sound was identical to the one I'd heard in my own apartment weeks before, only this time, it was much louder, and it seemed to be calling just for me. After that day at the abandoned telephone exchange, I lived in a state of alert. Every night, I looked at the clock and counted the minutes until midnight. The imaginary rings began to haunt me, sometimes in the silence of the early morning, sometimes in the midst of trivial conversations, like a reminder that my time was running out. But no matter how hard I tried to push the thought away, I knew the call would come. It always does. That night, it was raining heavily. The city slept under the constant sound of raindrops hitting the sidewalks, and the power flickered occasionally. I was sitting at the table, reviewing the latest case records, when the minute hand reached 12. The phone rang. Not just any ringing, but that dragging, metallic sound that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond this world. I answered. Silence. Then, the same cold, precise voice pronounced my full name. This time, however, there was something different. A longer pause, as if waiting for an answer. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like any sound could pass through the receiver. Without thinking, I asked, "What do you want from me?" And for the first time, the voice responded with something other than names. It simply said, "It's time." The call dropped. The room fell into absolute silence, and all the lights went out simultaneously. I stood there in the darkness, feeling like I was no longer alone. I don't know if that was my last night, or just the beginning of something much bigger. But if you ever hear that midnight chime, remember, it's not always safe to answer. So, after everything you've heard, tell me, if your home phone rang at midnight, would you answer it? Think about it. Because this case isn't just about mysterious deaths, but about patterns we often prefer to ignore, and in real life, these touches can come in other forms. signs, warnings, sensations that insist on alerting us. How many times have you felt something was about to happen, and yet you didn't act? If this story has you scratching your head, take it as a lesson. Not every warning comes with an explanation, and sometimes the difference between escaping or falling into your own destiny lies in recognizing the signs in time. It could be a decision, an opportunity, or even someone who crosses your path unexpectedly. Now I want to know, do you believe this case has a rational explanation, or do you think we're dealing with something supernatural? And what's more, have you ever experienced something similar that made you doubt logic? Tell us in the comments, because your stories can help us find connections that are still hidden. And of course, if you want to continue exploring mysteries, investigations, and cases that defy reason, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next story could be the one that changes the way you see the world.